Hey, good afternoon. Welcome to today's edition of the Coal Seam. I'm Chris Hamilton, and I'll be your host throughout today's program. Joining me in the studio today is Mr. Jason Bostic, Senior Vice President with the West Virginia Coal Association. And we're going to talk about some mining trends, some statistical data, and just some current issues that's impacting the industry from both some things that are going on in Washington, D.C. to some local issues as well. So, Jason, maybe a good place to start today's program is just a little bit of a recap of where we are production-wise. I know we're off just a little bit from where we were this time last year, but there's some things in the works that leave us optimistic that over the next couple of years, the current production pricing levels are going to be sustained.
Yeah, I think so. Because if you look year to date where we're at, we're off by about 8%. Off a little more in the northern part of the state than we are in the southern part of the state. And I think some of that has something to do with the market disruptions that you saw in the early part of 23 and through 2022, when, as you know, the world as a whole was extremely short on energy. So there was a panic buying practice or a pattern that developed not only here in this country but around the world. And stockpiles were built out of fear that they might not be able to attain the raw material, their energy. So I think in the up to the, what are we now, the 8th month, going into the 9th month of this year, we've got what I call stockpile hangover. So some of our customers do have extended stockpiles that they're slowly working through. And I think that accounts more than demand destruction for kind of the 8% difference between this year versus last year in terms of production.
Still produce a lot of high-grade metallurgical coal here within the state. Still produce high-grade thermal coal, which utilities around the country, around the world desire. What's that breakdown? About 60% thermal coal, 40%, or maybe 58% thermal.
It's a
little higher.
Yeah, it's along those lines, and that number has continued to change. And I think here in West Virginia particularly, we're going to see more of a overall contribution to the production mix coming from the metallurgical side of our business. And the other interesting thing that's happened to the met production in West Virginia is typically, historically, people think of metallurgical coal being mined only in southern West Virginia, south of the interstate, Charleston south, down into what we would consider the traditional coal fields. But in the last 10 years, there's been huge developments of metallurgical coal mining in northern West Virginia, areas that we typically just thought of as steam coal or thermal coal. And that's filling a void or a niche in the global steel market as steel producers become more adept at using what would, at first blush, appear to be lower quality coal. But they managed to incorporate that, what we call high volatile met coal from northern West Virginia into their coke production plants.
I was looking over some recent production trends, and three things jumped out at me. First, world coal consumption is still climbing. We're still using more and more coal, which bodes well for West Virginia being a primary exporter of its coal. The fact that as a state we are exporting as much coal as we are consuming coal domestically. And the third part of that is we're exporting increased volumes of thermal coal than what we were before. I mean, those three things, we're exporting as much as we're using here. And of course that stands to reason as we continue to close plants and shrink that domestic market. But man, our export capability is really, could be a big boom for the state of West Virginia.
It can. And I think that's going to be, like you said, we were within, I think you and I calculated it, 100,000 or 300,000 tons of, export versus domestic product used in this country. And exporting coal is nothing new to West Virginia. Obviously, we've been the leading coal export state for probably 50 years or longer in this country. But the volume's going up, and the fact that we are sending that much overseas. But that's where West Virginia I think is uniquely positioned. First, go back to your opening when you talked about the quality of our coal. We do have the best coal in the entire country, whether it's from a thermal standpoint or a metallurgical standpoint. From the thermal side, we offer the most heat with less complicating constituents, sulfur dioxide, ash, and other things. And from the metallurgical side, you just can't beat West Virginia's product because we have all 4 blends of the metallurgical coal that's used ultimately to make steel. And I think the export market's going to become just more and more and more important for us as a state, and one that the State Commerce Department and our leaders here are going to have to start thinking about, because it's a different posture and a different position to be a participant in a global energy market than what we're typically used to.
We have indicated before that, particularly as it relates to climate change and environmental issues, that whole Pacific Rim, India and China primarily, consume 7-8 times more coal than we do. Mm-hmm. Those are developing countries. They're building new buildings, they're building houses, businesses, and so they continue to consume more power. And building the infrastructure, they need more met coal.
Chris, and I think the other thing that's starting to happen around the world to a degree is, if you talk in terms of environmental impact, and if you even want to stretch it to climate change, part of the world's problem with its coal appetite is the quality of the coal that is being consumed. And China and some of the other Pacific Rim nations that are developing in leaps and bounds had a history of using extremely low quality coal, where you had to burn 4 times as much to get the same heat equivalent as you would from a ton of West Virginia coal. And I think that trend might be changing too. I think there might be a realization, not only in China, but in the next, what I would consider to be developing country, which would be India, whose coal appetite's going to be just, I think, unbelievable, is, there's a realization that we could get a better energy output if we use higher quality coal. So I think that again steers them back to North America and to West Virginia specifically.
One of the things we've talked about is this, diminishing domestic market. And of course, as you well know, we continue to read about a number of concerns being expressed by our grid operators, some utilities, the Federal Energy Commission, Federal Energy Reliability Commission. They're all warning EPA to be careful with this menu of rules that you continue to impose on coal-fired plants, because we need those plants operating. Mm-hmm. We need every amp of every power source capable of producing electricity because of the growing need, and because of the effort that's underway to secure the grid.
Yeah, and I think that those voices have become somewhat of a chorus over the last 2 years, and now I would say most recently they've become kind of a crescendo of shouting opinions. Mm-hmm. That reality has finally run headlong into the energy demand. So not only do we have the typical energy use of this country and the fact that a stable, productive, advancing economy has to have power when it's needed, but the other thing that I think's come about within the last year are all these data centers, where these huge data processing centers where computers and servers just run continuously 24 hours a day to satisfy the consumer needs of the World Wide Web or whatever. And those things are absolute energy hogs. We had a discussion yesterday, as a matter of fact, about...
They're huge facilities also.
They are huge.
And they would dwarf the new Nucor being built down in Mason County.
And the fact that we heard yesterday that one good-sized data center will be more of an energy consumer than the electric arc furnaces at Nucor shocked me, I know.
Yeah, it shocked me as well.
That's almost unbelievable. But
because we were dealing with providing energy to a couple Bitcoin operations, and those were almost on mobile. They were very modular and transportable within they were almost like tractor trailers. Mm-hmm. And so they were relatively small compared to these data centers that we see in operation.
Yeah.
State of Virginia has, I think I read almost, they're putting their 40th one in right now. And as we also heard earlier this week, that Northern Virginia is to the data centers with Silicon Valley and California, was to some of the high-tech and innovation centers there.
And I think, Chris, the location of those data centers, something that was made public earlier this week, is, generally the grid operators, the regional transmission organizations, or the independent system operators, however you want to categorize them, which in our case is PJM. It's MISO in the central part of the state, or the central part of the country, and Texas has its own, which is called ERCOT. But traditionally, even with the retirement of coal plants that we've seen since 2005, again, all brought about primarily by federal regulation, the ISOs and the system operators and the grid operators had excess capacity amongst themselves, where PJM could send power to MISO when it was in need, and vice versa. And we could move those megawatts and those gigawatts around seamlessly without the public being aware of it, to make sure that no single system or no single grid component ran short of electricity. But with the advent of these data centers, what the MISO grid operator made public earlier this week was, in their case, in MISO's case, those grid...
And MISO's North Central America?
Central, yeah, the central part of the
Indiana,
country.
Illinois.
Runs down into the Texas border.
It does.
Yeah, they may have the northern part of Texas.
Okay.
But the point MISO was making was the data centers in PJM, the ones in Virginia that you were talking about, will consume PJM's excess generation capacity, so PJM can't provide power to MISO.
Now, what does this mean? What we're talking about now, what we're doing is seeing a fairly immediate surge in demand.
Yes.
Electrical demand, which should bode well for the state of West Virginia and our coal-fired units here.
It absolutely should, because we do have excess capacity in West Virginia. We generate more than we use. And for the grid, generally, not
People
just...
probably aren't aware of this, but we send a lot of electricity. But 50% of what we generate goes to Virginia, Kentucky, Ohio, little in Maryland.
And we are typically, on a daily basis, an energy exporter. And just to use an example, within what we call the PJM grid, which is kind of what we operate in, we are typically shipping boatloads of power to Ohio. Ohio is chronically power short. But the other thing that West Virginia's coal plants do, again, this is seamless, the public doesn't see this, it all travels by wire, is we pump a lot of power into the MISO grid because they are chronically short. So if the data center demand in Virginia and elsewhere, we even have, I think, some folks that are looking to West Virginia to build some of those centers. If that takes away the capacity of our coal plants in West Virginia, number one, that's good for us as ratepayers in this state, because the excess power that's sold into the open market, the customers in West Virginia that pay to maintain the power plants get that as a rate return and as a rate reduction. But the other thing it tells us is that we won't have the capacity to ship to MISO when they do run out of power, which is on almost a daily basis.
Yeah, saw that. The other thing we saw earlier this week is, even though West Virginia electric rates have gone up a little bit, but so has everything.
They have.
I mean, the price of power everywhere on the universe has creeped upwards here throughout the past 12, 18 months. But what we heard was that even though the rates have creeped upwards, they're still very competitive. And they're still sort of right in the middle of the pack, not as high as what some local media reports would leave you to believe. And the residential power rates, with the exception of maybe Kentucky, which has some unique, crossover with
there's some TVA involvement.
TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority. But the point I'm making here is I think our residential rates are cheaper than any of our surrounding states before Kentucky.
They are. We did a power price survey based on federal government data for the year to date. And we are lower generally than every other state around us. We're lower than the national average. We are lower than the PJM grid operator average. So if we were to close our power system or our power plants in West Virginia, we'd have to buy power from PJM, and our power is cheaper. But the point that you made earlier, that the power prices have gone up here, but power prices nationally have gone up at a higher rate than they have in West Virginia. I think one disadvantage we do have here is our power rates were so low for so long. We were among the lowest in the entire nation.
We used to boast that we were fourth or fifth in the nation, behind, I think, some hydroelectric plants and maybe a nuclear or two.
Yeah, and we have lost some of that advantage. Obviously, not all of it. We have lost some of that advantage as the federal regulatory system put its arms around our power plants in West Virginia and either forced the retirement of 6 plants that we had in West Virginia, or it required billions of dollars of upgrades to continue to run. And we still are repaying that investment as ratepayers. But again, I think even if you look at the inflation factor over the last 10 years, the rates in West Virginia have gone up less than inflation has.
They have.
So we still have a fairly cheap, and most importantly, as we talk about data centers and exploding growth and accelerated coal plant retirements potentially around the country, we've got one that's reliable. I don't know that in 5 years to say that we're going to be able to say that about the entire country.
Typically there's a lot of bad things that people point to that come out of Washington, D.C., but this week we learned that the efforts of one of our state senators, Shelley Moore Capito, and Congresswoman Carol Miller have led coalitions to develop a pretty significant pushback against the EPA's efforts and their menu of rules that will cause further loss of coal generation. I believe both sponsored congressional review acts, one in the U.S. Senate, one in the House, and again, both have cultivated rather large coalitions of their colleagues to support those initiatives and work with them towards getting it done.
Yeah, the Congressional Review Act, Chris, as you know, it's Congress's kind of break glass here in case of emergency way.
It's a good way to characterize it.
Yeah, it's the only way really that Congress has to exert some control over the bureaucratic power of the executive agencies. So a Congressional Review Act motion, if it's adopted by the Senate, if it's adopted by Congress, both the Senate and the House, and isn't vetoed or isn't vetoed overridden by the Congress, it nullifies a federal regulation. And this has happened a couple times before, but primarily it's been used. It was used in 2016. It'll likely be used again, and it's aimed at rules from EPA and the power grid. That's what's motivated the interest in the Congressional Review Act.
It's a pretty rare initiative from Congress.
Absolutely.
Even though it's happened before, it doesn't happen every day.
Before 2016, I think it had been used one time.
One time.
And in 2016, I think I'm correct, it was used 4 times to nullify EPA or OSM rules from the Obama administration. And again, it's it's almost an emergency action, and it's an indication of how dangerous or threatening some of these rules are. And in the example of the Clean Power Plan, you've had for the first time ever, I think, some of these grid operators that we were talking about, the MISOs, the PJMs, that actually participated in federal litigation to tell the U.S. Supreme Court, look, this rule will devastate the electric system. And those folks have typically never done that.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's unprecedented.
Unprecedented. They're typically agnostic as it regards politics.
I think it was the amicus brief they filed in the one litigation.
Yeah, and it was every major power grid operator in the country.
26, 27 states headed by our Attorney General, Patrick Morrisey.
Yes, sir. And that's landmark litigation. We use that term a lot because it seems like we have one of these cases every 4 years. But it really will, it's another opportunity for the Supreme Court to, again, throttle the executive state and the bureaucratic state and remind them that you have to operate within the guardrails of what Congress enacted. And I don't think that anybody intended for the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to regulate the nation's energy system from the power plant all the way to the wall plug.
No. In fact, that was those points were all well made, and that was at the core of the Supreme Court's decision a couple years ago when the EPA got off the reservation as they attempted a similar rule.
Yeah. And you know, Chris, one of the things that I look back on with respect to even the first version of the Clean Power Plan, which was the EPA West Virginia case, and now this second version, which is the subject of the CRA resolution, is the fact that EPA has refused to include, since 2015, let's say, probably 2005 maybe, you know, what made the Clean Air Act so successful in the first 40 years of its existence as it regards reducing emissions from every type of facility, not just coal plants, but everything, was the concept of trading. That, you know, a utility or a power plant operator could apply super expensive, complicated pollution controls to one plant and reduce emissions from that one plant, build credits, and apply them to a smaller facility where maybe the pollution control technology investment was either one, physically impossible, or just didn't make monetary sense.
Right.
But every rule since 2005 has not had that component in it. It's a comply or close posture that EPA has taken, and I think that's what's led to, or out of kind of a no other choice situation where states like West Virginia and even these power grid operators have to challenge these things legally. EPA has chosen to make the Clean Air Act punitive instead of workable.
Well, you have a lot of things working, kind of converging together that's leading to this increased power surge. You know, you have these large data centers, you have this whole AI, artificial intelligence that's consuming a lot of power. Manufacturing is on the increase nationwide, not just here. You know, there's Nucors, there's Hope Energy, different things going in a lot of different places. A lot of federal grant money subsidizing new manufacturing facilities. And electric cars are consuming more and more electricity, not necessarily here in Appalachia, but in your western states nationally. They're having an effect of draining some of the grid and some of the electricity. So on one hand, you have this huge demand that's growing, and you know there's nothing there to today to provide the energy. So let's slow down a little bit. Let's not shut these coal plants down. They're all totally compliant, and represent a lot of jobs and a lot of good work that's going on.
Yeah, the other thing, Chris, that doesn't get a whole lot of attention, but I think will maybe in the next year or two, or even the next month or two, is the aggressive renewable or intermittent energy targets that certain states have is actually increasing the strain and the demand for baseload energy. So a state like, pick one, let's say Virginia, mandates a 30% intermittent solar wind power energy mix by 2030 or whatever the date might be. The fact that there's an impression that you can replace a megawatt of coal power or a megawatt of nuclear power with a megawatt of wind power, and that's not true, given their intermittent nature and the diffused nature of the resources. The fact that you have to build so many windmills over X amount of areas to replace what is, by comparison, a very compact coal plant. So for every 1 megawatt of intermittent energy you build, you have to have a megawatt and a half of backup almost to be able to come online instantaneously and take up the slack should the wind quit blowing or the clouds show up unexpectedly and cover that solar panel.
I thought I saw where that ratio was more like 7 to 1.
It
8
is.
to 1.
It's remarkably high, especially for wind power, which
I don't want to
really
mislead
surprised.
anybody. You said a unit and a half or something, a backup. But the replacement value is more like 7 to 1 or 8 to 1.
The true replacement value approaches sometimes almost 14 to 1.
Yes.
Especially with wind, which kind of surprised me when I saw those numbers. But that's putting more of a strain on the baseload power system as well. So at the same time that you have the politics of the world driving the intermittent sources of energy, they don't understand or don't care to understand that you're going to have the baseload energy not only to maintain the system that you have, but to keep the windmills and the solar panels workable from an energy standpoint. So that we're still going to have to be part of that energy mix. Not only coal, but nuclear or any other baseload fuel for that matter. But it's the coal plants, it's the coal plant portion of the baseload energy mix in the country that is so much at risk right now.
Second largest mining state behind Wyoming.
Yes, sir.
And we still hire more working miners than any other mining state. All the indirect jobs and contractors that we use here total north of 50,000 individuals that show up at a mine site or are involved in the transportation of our produced goods.
And we have
pretty remarkable.
We have a mining presence either through direct coal extraction or the ancillary service business or the vendors that we use in every one of our 55 counties. We're the largest underground coal producing state in the country. We've got the most longwall mining systems, the most advanced coal extraction technology of any other state in the country. And we have the most sophisticated coal export system.
We do, and our close proximity to all the major ports aids that without any question. And when you think of all the people that touch a ton of coal, from the time it's actually extracted from the underground deposit to where it is injected in a steel mill somewhere or a coal-fired plant, it's really phenomenal. I mean, it's a lot of people. It's a whole orchestra of activities and individuals responsible for specific aspects of it.
Yeah, it truly is a remarkable feat of logistics.
We'd be remiss if we didn't just observe that we're in the midst of mine rescue competition. There's a huge event going on, extremely well attended right here in Logan County. We had two major companies, Alliance Coal's Tunnel Ridge up in Ohio County, and we have the Black Hawk mine rescue team that just captured top national honors in the national meet. And these guys are the special agents of the industry. I mean, they really are. That's our special forces. They run towards the fire, not away from it. And they just do an incredible job out there and are constantly on standby to respond to emergency situations. So with that, we're going to have to close today's program. We'll get you back on here in a couple weeks and continue this discussion. Jason, thanks so much for coming by, and thank you for tuning in to the Library Television station in Coal Seam today.